Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today is episode 30 of Commander the Great War. It is the final installment in my series looking at Commander the Great War, a series that has gone on for 30 episodes now that started all the way back on July 28th of 2014, almost a year and a half ago. It's by far my longest series on YouTube. Probably my most successful in terms of average viewership throughout the whole series. The first video, if you go all the way back, is over 18,000 views now, and most of the series has well over 1,000 in each video, with several having quite a bit more than that. We've varied from talking about gameplay for stints to talking about different historical episodes that occurred throughout World War I, and we are finally coming to the conclusion of our version of World War I, a version which was not too unsimilar from the way the actual First World War resulted, although with a few key differences. The Germans advanced rapidly in the west and struggled to deal with the Russian menace in the east. There was no Tannenberg, and Germany was nearly overrun in the east. That things went better for Russia initially than historically. Meanwhile, Germany advanced close to Paris but was stopped, just as historically happened, and there was severe pressure put on the Germans and the Austrians on the Italian front. The Serbians were overwhelmed eventually, which is historically what happened on the Austro-Serbian front. The Romanians and the Ottomans, the Romanians were defeated, and the Ottomans dealt the British some serious blows before eventually being pushed back through Palestine, just as happened historically, and eventually the costly war and the German and Austrian combination of forces was able to overwhelm Russia and force a revolution which knocked Russia out of the war. Similarly, once the Russian Empire was forced out of the war, the Germans were able to divert massive forces from the east to the west for one last push. A front line in the Western Front which was nearly crumbling. The Germans were slowly being pushed back and things looked gloom, but all of a sudden these massive armies from the east were diverted and were able to help deal with the Western Allies and launch their own massive offensive in the spring and winter, the winter and spring of 1917 and 18. Things happened a little bit ahead of schedule. We're just into March here of 1918 as we're finally starting to overwhelm the Allies. But nonetheless, the spring offensives have come off and have met with great success. Just as in history, Germany has been poor at developing armored units, unlike the British and French, but fortunately for us, our spring offensives are having great success, and that may be in large part due to the fact that the Germans never really unleashed a U-boat campaign against the Allied convoys, which gave them much-needed supplies, but also prevented antagonizing the United States and prevented the United States from entering the fray. So, all things said, things were similar, but in this case the 1918 offensive has proven decisive, and we have seriously breached the Allied lines, and, spoiler alert, we will reign victorious in about 20 minutes or so. In this video, first of all, I want to apologize if it's not clear. I have a cold. I've been battling a cold for the last few days, a pretty bad one too, so if my audio quality isn't great, I apologize for that. I was trying to put it off, but I didn't want to keep putting the video off. It had been longer than I would like between videos at this point, far longer, and I apologize for that. But yeah, we're gonna go ahead. We're gonna have the show must go on throughout my cold, and we're gonna continue this video. The video will be about a little bit over 25 minutes long, and in it, I've already kind of given a summary of the First World War as it relates to what happened in this game versus reality. You can see here we have driven deep into Paris, or into France, and we've cut off 4 full Allied armies, now in a massive pocket near Verdun. That's going to help lead to the reduction of 2 British and 2 French armies there under heavy artillery bombardment, and with the loss of those 4 units, the ability of the Allies to muster any sort of coherent front line on the Western Front is going to be limited, because again, they won't have the manpower to replace such a massive loss. Now, what the topic of discussion in this video is going to be is, as I mentioned in the last video, I want to go ahead and talk about the 100 Days Campaign. That is the final Allied offensive against the Germans in the West in 1918, after the failure of the German Spring Offensive, which we had talked about in our previous video. Now, we've talked about it a little bit so far in the previous videos, but in order to understand the 100 Days Campaign, we really need to look back at the German drives in the spring of 1918, specifically the final drive, the fifth drive that's sometimes referred to as the Battle of the Marne. This is really, I won't call it the turning point, because I think that really comes at the end of the third German drive, where the Germans are stopped short of Paris, their last really successful drive. But the fourth and the fifth drive mark a notable departure, where the Germans really have used up most of their stormtroopers, and they're left with mainly kind of human wave assault tactics. They try going with the old tactics, but they just don't have the manpower for it. Not to mention, the Allies have designed a defense in depth so that they're well aware of how to deal with these German offensives. Basically, don't put too many troops up front, hold large reserve units, and make the enemy attack trench line after trench line. The fourth drive fails, and then the Germans try again with the fifth drive, which is sometimes referred to as the Second Battle of the Marne. And the Germans are stopped cold. After just 3 days, the German offensive peters out, with basically no successful advance. They gain a little bit of ground, but not much. And after 3 days of attacking and no breakthroughs, the Allies launch a counteroffensive with more than 10 divisions and more than 100 tanks that stops the Germans cold and drives them back, basically to the starting point of their offensive. So at this point, the momentum in this conflict has certainly shifted. The Allies now have a definite advantage in terms of momentum. Couple that with the fact that throughout the successful German drives, where the Germans were advancing 10, 20, 30 miles into the rear, the Germans were taking Allied supply dumps, and they were seeing just how well the Allies were supplied. That American industry churning out vast quantities of supplies, and even the British and the French as well, doing much better. Germany had been crippled by years of blockade, and they couldn't compete in terms of supplying they couldn't even supply their people at home, they couldn't supply the troops at the front, and these German troops, which are often on the verge of starvation or certainly malnourished, are suddenly coming into these supply dumps with massive hordes of food and ammunition and everything that the Germans have been going without for years. And there's some serious loss of discipline at points where the Germans kind of start gorging themselves on these supplies. Not to mention, word gets out about how well the Allies are supplied, and, obviously it doesn't seem like the Germans are winning the war if the Allies can afford to have these kind of massive dumps of extremely, well-supplied troops and all this, food and whatnot. It seems ludicrous how well the Allies are supplied. So you start to hear grumblings within the German armory. The morale starts to drop. And then when you have your fifth offensive get stopped cold by an Allied counteroffensive, morale really starts to drop. This was called the peace offensive. It was supposed to win the war, or at least in Ludendorff's mind, it was supposed to draw more Allied reserves from up in Flanders south. It failed largely for some of the same reasons that the German offensive in 1914 failed. The successful German advances advanced so far, so fast, that the troops at the front line were really low on supply, they were exhausted, they didn't have fuel for their aircraft. And actually, in this offensive, the German Air Force lost air superiority largely due to supply deficiencies, and the Allied aircraft were able to see the masses of German troops building up using this air reconnaissance, and air reconnaissance had a key role in the first Battle of the Marne as well, and it was intelligence that the Allies could use to know that the offensive was coming, know where it was coming, and prepare for it. And again, the German offensive failed. The Allies launched this counterattack, the Germans are driven back, and despite severe resistance, the Germans are steadily checked at every point. So on August 6th, and again, we're no longer in spring, but by August 6th, the German spring offensives are stopped with the defeat at the Battle of the Second Marne. It was a big blow to the German morale, and again, the Allies were able to claim victory and gain morale because of it. So the Allied spirits are riding high, the Germans were down in the dumps, and to many Germans it felt like the war was over. That was borne out in just a couple of days, because as soon as Operation Michael had not failed, but had been stopped, after the first German drive that had accomplished more than 40 miles of advance, the Allies began preparing a counterattack. Now, by this point, the British manpower was severely drained. They were relying heavily on colonial troops, but the Americans were also deploying vast numbers of troops to the region. And by August 8th of 1918, the Allies had gained a massive manpower superiority. We mentioned that at the start of the spring offensive, the Allies actually outnumbered the Germans actually outnumbered the Allies, and that was true. But by August of 1918, the Germans were heavily outnumbered. The Americans had almost 2 million men in the field. The British had brought in large numbers of reinforcements, largely colonial troops, from the Middle East, now that the conflict there was wrapping up, that the Ottomans had been driven out of Palestine and were being driven back into Anatolia. And the French had about 2 million men as well. So the Allies had right around 6 million men available to be used in the 100 Days campaign. The Germans were at about 4.5 million. The Germans had rushed more than a million men to the Western Front after the fall of Russia, and they had lost over 600,000 casualties in these offensives that had not won the war. They had lost almost all of that manpower that they rushed west, and now the Allies had more than 2 million fresh American troops, well supplied, well equipped, high morale, coming off victory at the Second Battle of the Marne. Well, the Allied offensive that they'd been preparing since the start of the German spring offensives occurred just 2 days after the Second Battle of the Marne. It occurred along the line of the Marne where the Germans had gained their most success, and the Allies concentrated more than 500 tanks to launch a concentrated offensive against the Germans. And the Germans were routed, basically, from the field. It wasn't the bloodiest of battles in World War I, not even close. Only about 30,000 German casualties, but about half of those were captured, and the Allies broke through the German lines, broke through a 12-mile wide gap. The armored units sowed panic in the German ranks, and the German army was nearly routed from the field. The advance would continue nearly unabated for the next 3 days, and the Germans, while still fighting fiercely on spots, you could tell the German army's confidence and the German army's morale had eroded to a dangerous degree. The offensive occurred on a Thursday, on August 8th, which was a Thursday, and the German commander, General Ludendorff, referred to it as Black Thursday, a black day in the German army. So the offensive continued, and the Germans were eventually driven back. They slowly started pulling out of their advanced locations from their spring offensives, and they were unable to stem the Allied tide. So the Germans began withdrawing back to the Hindenburg Line. The Hindenburg Line, if you remember, was the jump-off point from the spring offensives. It was basically the front line that had remained static from 1915 all the way through to the spring of 1918. A heavily defended, fortress-like front line that was a fortress. I mean, you could think of the Maginot Line, you could think of just line after line of trenches with supporting trenches, machine guns with pillboxes, well-sighted artillery positions along good ridge lines. The Hindenburg Line was a fearsome objective to attack, and the Germans were retreating to this. It would shorten their front line, although it would give up almost all of the ground that they had gained in the spring offensives. Nonetheless, because of the Allied pressure, the Germans had to do this. They thought they might have a chance to hold the Allies at this line. Again, it was a very well-defended line, and the Germans, despite being outnumbered, retreating to this entrenched position, should at least give the Allies pause. In fact, one of the senior British generals said that if the German army had displayed the fighting characteristics of the German army just 2 years before, there would have been no way that the Allies would have broken through the Hindenburg Line. In fact, they probably wouldn't have even attacked it head on. They would have done something else. But in these defeats, in the Battle of Amiens, which is where the Black Thursday occurred, and then another battle near the Somme as the Germans were retreating toward the Hindenburg Line, it was clear the German army was coming apart. The morale was low. The right thing for the Allies to do was to keep the pressure on. So a series of rearguard actions occurred as the Germans withdrew, and after the offensive started on August 8th, by September 2nd, the Germans were back nearly into the Hindenburg Line, into this defensive fortification line along the Western Front, where their deficiency in manpower and artillery and equipment would be somewhat negated by the strong, long-prepared earthworks that were in place to help the Germans out. So again, you would think, okay, maybe things are going to pause here, but the Allies, knowing that the German army seemingly was coming apart at the seams, that morale was low, that fighting quality was low, decided it was time to keep the pressure on. Again, they had nearly 2 million American troops, and this was a key factor. I mentioned in this game of mine, I was able to do very well and hang on throughout a long, protracted conflict, largely because we didn't have to deal with American manpower. Well, imagine if the Allies had all of a sudden like 10 more infantry units, 10 more heavy units in this game. The Western Front, we never would have broken through. We would have gained some ground, but the war would be over going the other direction. Well, the exact opposite thing happened in the real world or in real life, and the Allies launched a massive 100-day-long offensive along the entirety of the First World War front that had been static for nearly 3 years. From 1915 to 1918, the Germans had withdrawn back into that heavily defended portion of the line, and a massive showdown was about to ensue. Preparatory attacks along the Hindenburg Line began nearly as soon as the Allies had advanced up to the line, like I said, around September 2nd. But the major offensive began around the 26th of September. About 24 days were left for the Allies to prepare for this massive offensive. It started with the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, which was America's one big offensive that they really helped drive in World War I. The French were definitely involved. The French committed 2 army groups to the offensive, but the Americans committed 2 army groups of their own. Over 1.3 million Americans fought in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and it actually took the Americans a while to break through, perhaps because of being green, perhaps because of the difficult terrain. The Meuse-Argonne was not near the massive bulge where the Allies were counterattacking into German territory that had been seized in the beginning of the war. A large part of this area was fairly close to the German border. So for the first the first week or so of the offensive, there wasn't a rapid breakthrough. It occurred in early October when it did occur, and the Americans lost heavy casualties throughout. The French lost about 70,000 casualties supporting the Americans, while the Americans lost about 122,000 casualties of their own. All told, the Germans lost over 126,000 of their own men, so the Allies actually lost more heavily than the Germans did, which again makes sense because the Allies were attacking such a heavy position. The Battle of St. Quentin Canal was also another offensive against the Hindenburg Line that took place from September 29th to October 10th and resulted in the total breakthrough of British forces with American troops supporting. There were 14 divisions involved, only 2 American divisions. A large number of Australian troops were involved here, and they were able to cross the St. Quentin Canal and lead to a total 12-mile breakthrough of the Hindenburg Line after just a couple of days of fighting. Another battle that took place along the Hindenburg Line was the 5th Battle of Ypres. Again, just giving you that idea of the front lines being in place for years and years and years. This is the 5th Battle of the city of Ypres, and this is the first decisive action in which the Allies totally break through. 28 Allied divisions, including the Belgian army, basically in resistance under King Albert, the British, the French, and the Americans all involved, 28 divisions against 16 German divisions, and the Germans are thrown back. And then another battle near Cambrai, where the Canadian troops, largely Canadian and New Zealand troops, along with some British troops, break through 21 British divisions Actually 21 British divisions, only 3 Canadian and 1 New Zealander division break through the Germans at about 12,000 casualties to 10,000. The Germans did continue to fight, and there were still heavy casualties throughout. As we mentioned, over 170,000 Allied casualties in the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, over 9,000 casualties at Ypres, over 12,000 casualties at Cambrai. But nonetheless, the Germans are retreating, and large numbers of German prisoners are giving up the fight. Again, 26,000 prisoners are captured at the Meuse-Argonne, and significant prisoners, over 10,000 at Ypres. So again, large numbers of prisoners being taken throughout, and it was just clear that the German army was basically done. Again, it was a defeated army in spirit. They basically thought there was no point of fighting anymore, and a large part of that really has to be credited. I don't want to toot the American horn or anything. I won't say the Americans played a decisive role in winning World War I, because from a military standpoint, they didn't. But from a psychological standpoint, to all of a sudden be facing 2 million fresh troops, basically an endless supply of troops, as your own manpower is totally exhausted, had to be horrible. Also, the French and the British ability to adjust rapidly to the German offensives and then turn around and launch offensives of their own with their massive manpower that they brought in from their colonial empires was another huge morale hit. The French and the British did the majority of the fighting on the Western Front, but there are these other factors where, troops that had been fighting elsewhere are suddenly able to come in to aid during this 1918 offensive. Again, the British troops from Palestine, French troops from North Africa and Central Africa, and the massive influx of American troops as well really crushed the German spirit. And another thing that we talked about in our previous videos, during the 1918 offensives, the Germans had taken the cream of their crop, all of the best troops, all of the most motivated troops, all of the most fit troops, put them into these elite units and used them to bash through the Allied lines and crush through the Allied lines to gain those massive successes that the Germans gained in the spring of 1918. Almost all of those troops are gone now, over 600,000 casualties. And now what's left is the B troops, the C troops, the less motivated troops, the more disheartened troops, the troops that are more susceptible to seeing these massive stockpiles of Allied casualties and wondering, what the heck are we fighting for? And then just days after the failure kicks in, just days after this peace offensive fails, a massive Allied counterattack starts, and basically 3 months of constant fighting without break. The German army was at its limit. It was exhausted. It was defeated in spirit. It was defeated on the battlefield. Although the German people refused to believe that, and many German troops kind of thought, wait a minute, we didn't really lose in the battlefield. They weren't decisively defeated in a battle where they were, rolled up or tactically defeated, but they were overwhelmed, and the morale just sank and collapsed. There'd be a mutiny at home. There'd be a mutiny in the German fleet. Troops started throwing down their arms. It was a psychological defeat that had massive military consequences. And that's basically how World War I ended in the Western Front. On November 11th, an armistice was signed. Ludendorff, before that, had realized the army is coming apart at its seams. We need to figure out a way to get out of this war now. And I guess the Germans didn't really realize how harsh the peace was going to be, or perhaps they would have continued to fight. But nonetheless, an armistice was signed, and by then the Germans were in no position to resist or oppose the armistice, and then you end up having the Versailles Treaty, the scuttling of the massive German battle fleet, and the end of World War I, which I'm not really going to talk about too much here in this video. We're coming to the close of our own video, but yeah, I mean, it's a little bit. Again, I'm not feeling well right now, but it's a little bit difficult to say. This is a special series, shifting gears a bit. That's the end of World War I and what we're going to talk about. But it's a year and a half long I've been making these videos, and sometimes I've been making a lot, sometimes I haven't. You can see here France has surrendered to us, so basically the defeat of France more or less ends the war for us. The other allies don't surrender for a little bit still. But this is a special series, and I hope I can duplicate the length of this series with Rule the Waves, which I will be returning to. That'll Rule the Waves, Operation Glacier, I've fallen way behind on Glacier. I intend to get back to it. Again, family members' wedding, holidays, and now being sick, just haven't had a whole lot of time over the past couple of weeks to really do much. But this is a special moment for me. I've had several series that I've started, like Buzz Aldrin, where I never really completed it, and I had a good roll going, and I lost, my momentum, and that's obviously not going to happen here because we completed it. This was a massive game, 30 episodes, 106 turns, almost 3 years to the day of fighting, and you can see here the massive Central Powers manpower situation. Actually, I was struggling a little bit if the French surrendered but the British kept fighting. I wasn't quite sure what I was supposed to do because I don't have a navy to invade Britain. I probably would have just swung everything to the Middle East and dealt with the British there. Fortunately, they surrender here in a turn or two. But yeah, I mean, this is a special moment. It's been a special series. I'd say I'd revisit the game for another episode, maybe playing as the Entente. But I think that's something that would have to be a ways off. There's so many other games that I want to play. Again, I want to make some videos of Operation Glacier. Definitely want to get back to Rule the Waves. I'm actually reading Robert Massey's Dreadnought, which was about the naval arms race leading up to the First World War, kind of the development of HMS Dreadnought, as well as just kind of everything leading up to that. It's a really good book, and I'm hoping it brings a little bit more depth and detail to my playing of Rule the Waves. And I'd like to get back to Scourge of War, play some of that, maybe talk some more about the Civil War. I know one of the areas I know the most about, far more than I know about World War I, is the Civil War. But I've been playing too many Civil War games lately. I had Scourge of War when the channel first started, but anyway, just kind of rambling here. I really appreciate you guys tuning in, continuing to support me. 2015 was another great year. I may have a roundup video where I kind of talk about some of the big milestones for the channel that year. It was huge for me, and I appreciate everybody's support throughout thick and thin, throughout time. The YouTube channel's been going on for like 4 years now, I think. 2012, I think, is when I started, 13, 14, 15. It's grown every year. Again, I'm still a peon when it comes to YouTube, but it's really heartening to see that constant growth year after year in terms of subs, in terms of views, and I enjoy it. I like talking about history. I like to see that you guys enjoy it, and I hope you guys continue to enjoy it, and I can continue to deliver entertaining and educational content, because the education component is important to me as well. But anyway, guys, that's going to do it here. You saw that the British surrendered. The French already surrendered. There's the Portuguese surrendering. I think they're and the Arabs surrendered as well. Ultimate victory for the Central Powers, guys. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.